Hello, I'm Libby Hill and I'm a speech and language therapist, and what I want to talk to you about today is selective mutism. So some of you will have heard about it, some of you will live with it. I want us to know more about it, it's really important. So what is selective mutism? Well, if we look at the children that I see, they want to speak, but they're unable to. So they can talk fully and freely, say at home, but maybe at school or other places, they just can't. And it's become a serious barrier to their communication. They've almost become afraid of the act of speaking, or maybe people hearing their voices. I'm not aware of my voice reverberating in my chest as I'm talking to you. But if I had sensory issues, that might put me off wanting to talk because it feels strange. So I've had some children who could go into a cathedral and talk beautifully, or they could talk outside, but they'd never heard their voice before at school. And it's really interesting to talk to older teenagers who have recovered from selective mutism, and they'll be able to talk about it just felt odd, I just couldn't do it. And what happens is that they become increasingly wary of any expectation to speak, and in time they learn to avoid the distress about having to talk by just avoiding communication. And it can be so much more than not being able to talk. If we can catch it when they're preschool age, it's so much better. If they're moving to secondary school, they've become the person who doesn't talk. And that's very difficult then to move on from that. It is possible, we'll talk about that a bit later. Now, we can usually think that we can spot anxiety. So common symptoms of anxiety might be body tension, maybe a blank facial expression, a lack of coping strategies, maybe avoidance of a situation. Mostly children can't analyse or explain the source of their anxiety, but it's usually associated with a feeling of general helplessness. So we think we can see anxiety, but actually we might not be able to. So don't we all mask? We don't want people to think that we're nervous or anxious, and children with selective mutism can be the same. So I tend to get a lot from teaching staff that, well, he was smiling, so he wasn't nervous, wasn't anxious. But when we actually look at the child, what it is an anxious smirk. So we can almost call it the selective mutism smirk. So it's like a fixed smile, but it's really more of a grimace, and it's showing that the child is very, very uncomfortable. So some will show anxiety, some won't. Some will have to look deeper for. They might be picking the skin on their thumb or screwing their skirt up. But there will be some who aren't showing any signs of anxiety. So what is selective mutism? Well, I'll actually read the definition for you. And it's a consistent failure to speak in specific social situations, despite being able to speak in other more familiar situations. And it's got to have lasted for at least a month after the start of nursery or the start of school. So some children who are very, very shy will take time to settle. But if they're still silent after 1 month, we really need to look at what we can do about it. And we also need to be sure that it isn't a lack of knowledge of the language. So our knowledge about children who are bilingual has come on massively. When I first qualified, they felt after 6 months things should be doing okay. Now they realise that children will often spend a 6 month fairly quiet period. It was an interesting family near where I live that I was working with the children's centre. So we had the brother who was lovely, but he spent the whole 6 months completely silent, and he was very, very shy. He didn't really interact with the other children, and there were only 1 or 2 adults that he interacted with. He was Chinese. His family wanted them to speak Mandarin, so they didn't speak any English at all, because they wanted to give them the best chance of learning as much Mandarin as possible before they had to start learning English. So until they started nursery, he hadn't even heard any English, and he really struggled. His sister, on the other hand, was a different personality, and she came bounding into nursery, and she let the world know she was there. So she was using a mixture of Mandarin and Pidgin English, and she was amazing. Completely different personality. But he didn't have selective mutism. He was a shy child who had difficulty with English. And within a year, he was fine. He was still shy, but his language skills had caught up, and he was talking fully and freely. And we also need to be aware that it isn't, that there are some situations where parents might say to me, I think my child's got selective mutism. But when we've asked more questions, we realise that they're actually pre-verbal. So maybe they've got ASD and they're not talking yet, but they're not talking yet across the board. So that's not selective mutism, that's a difficulty with learning language. And we really need to be quite clear about that. So if in summary, if we think about it, what's selective mutism? Well, we need to see it as a manifestation of social anxiety, or let's look at it as a phobia of talking. These children, we could say, are temperamentally predisposed. So these are children who struggle to take normal life events in their stride. They could be the type of child that has a phobia of spiders, or phobia of flush toilets, you know, the old-fashioned chain ones, a phobia of flying. So it's a certain type of personality who gets selective mutism. But also, quite often, the reactions of others are reinforcing that silence rather than speech. So if we look at the incidence and the onset, it's most frequently reported between 3 and 5 years. However, what I found last year when I did some research with late teenagers, early 20s, interestingly, all their parents felt that they had recovered from selective mutism, that was their words, but the children or the young people didn't. They felt that they were recovering or coping better, but they didn't say that they'd got over it. But there was quite a high proportion there who actually didn't develop selective mutism until teenagehood, until they'd moved to secondary school. But typically, it's at the time when they start either nursery or it's the time when they start school. So it's the first time that they're away from home and everything is very, very scary. Sometimes teenagers will be able to identify what happened. So I was talking to a 16-year-old the other day, and the situation had been quite drastic. She'd been at home with her mum and they were doing lots of lovely things together, and then her parents had split up, so her mum had to go out to work, and she at 2 had to go to full-time nursery. And from that moment she didn't speak at nursery or at school. And she was coming to me at 16 because she realised that all the usual rites of passage of a teenager were going to pass her by, because if you can't talk, how do you pass your driving test? How do you get the Saturday job to afford the lessons to get your driving test? And then what about college? How are you going to do an interview if you can't talk? And so she'd realised that actually she needed some help. And I find I have a lot of referrals of 16 to 17-year-olds. But usually the onset is 3 to 5. Sometimes they will link it with bullying or some sort of humiliation. That's usually with the older ones when they start secondary school, and they'll be able to tell me what they feel triggered it or caused it. And sometimes it can be a gradual progression, excuse me, where they have been very shy, they've managed to say a few things, but it hasn't been handled in the right way, and then that can become selective mutism in a few individuals. Usually with speech, language and communication difficulties, we have far more boys than girls. In this particular problem, there are slightly more girls than boys. Some of them will have other issues, so they will have a speech difficulty, delayed language, or sometimes it's associated with autistic spectrum disorder. The incidence is epidemiologically quite rare, but it's still 1 in 125 to 1 in 150. So if you think about a small primary school having 150 children, they're going to have one. And obviously, the bigger the primary school, the more children with selective mutism they have. Local to here is a huge primary school of nearly 1,000 children. And I actually know 5 children in there who've got selective mutism. So that's significant, isn't it? What we also find is that the incidence is higher in geographically or ethnically separated communities. So in the 1980s I worked in the Dudley area, and there was an estate there called Kate's Hill with a lot of children who they'd either come over from Pakistan or their parents had come over from Pakistan, and in one class we actually had 4 little girls with selective mutism, and it was a 3-class entry. There were 2 in one and 1 in another, and somebody had the bright idea that we'd put them all together. And I knew that wouldn't work, but hey, you know, everything's worth a try. But it was a very quiet group session, shall we say. And each one will need to be treated differently. And if you're anxious about communicating in a group is so much worse. So when we're looking at a diagnosis of selective mutism, we actually have to be quite certain that it's selective mutism. So there will be children who are reluctant talkers, but if the situation's right and they're feeling confident, then they will talk. Whereas selective mutism is usually much more rigid than that. We'll come back to that in a minute. It could be pure selective mutism, and we actually have to look at whether it's high profile selective mutism or low profile selective mutism. And again, I want to come back to that because that's a really, really important thing that I want to let you know about. We need to see, is it just selective mutism or is there some social anxiety disorder there as well? And is it selective mutism plus other things? So we really have to be quite clear. What it's not is associated with traumatic mutism. So traumatic mutism is where there's a sudden onset with an identifiable trigger. And that might lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks. It's a completely different ball game. The best example that I can think of is was it the early 90s, I think, with Rachel Nickell on Wimbledon Common, and her son was with her when she was murdered, and he had traumatic mutism, and I believe that lasted for a number of years. It was across the board, so he actually couldn't talk to anybody. There is also something called progressive mutism, which is where they can talk fully and freely at home, but then they begin to lose that ability, so then they become silent and don't talk. But that is just a phase, and it's usually where their anxiety has become so great that it's just not doable anywhere. But it's very, very rare, so you're unlikely to come across that one. So if we're looking at reluctant talkers versus selective mutism, what are we really talking about? Well, everybody can be a reluctant talker in some situations. So take me, for example. I can talk fully and freely for England, but I don't really like parties. So I can talk at work situations, but actually I'm not brilliant at parties. So we all know what happens when maybe somebody's getting married and we like them, we work with them, and they say, oh, would you like to come to the reception? And of course, most of us say, that'd be great. And it isn't really, because you don't know anybody. So some people will sweep into the party and say, oh, hi, how are you? How do you know the bride? Or, you know, oh, I'm so-and-so, it's really nice to meet you, tell me all about you. There's not that many of us would do that. There would be some who are own agenda and think, oh God, I agreed to come, but actually I just want to go to the bar. So they're at the bar all night, or the food table. Others, like me, I'm okay talking to other people, but I'm not going to make the first move. So I will have my glass of wine and I will stand there with my glass of wine. And if someone comes and talks to me, then okay, I'll join in. So that's more of a reluctant talker. Whereas children with selective mutism wouldn't be able to talk at all. And the pressure of somebody, especially they didn't know, coming up to them and wanting a conversation would just be awful. Whereas for those of us who are just a bit shy or reluctant, it's not comfortable, but hey, you know, it's not the end of the world. So it's a big difference. It's much, much more than being a reluctant talker. You will find that children do get a diagnosis of reluctant talker or reluctant speaker in areas where the clinical commissioning group don't commission selective mutism therapy or assessment. And as speech and language therapists, many are becoming not able to work with selective mutism because they haven't got the experience and they haven't got the training and they don't need it for the job that they have. So those of us who work with children with selective mutism a lot, we will have done more training and we will have more knowledge to be able to cope with it. And so we will be very clear what is reluctant talking and what is selective mutism. Now, something that you might not have heard about, even if you've heard about selective mutism, is that there are different types. So pure selective mutism is where they don't talk at all in that particular situation. And they're quite easy to diagnose because they just don't say anything. The ones that are harder to diagnose have got what we call low profile selective mutism. And that's where the desire to please the adult, the desire to conform, overrides the fear of talking. But how stressful is that? You know, you want to please, so you're actually going to put yourself way out of your comfort zone to do something. But they won't be able to talk fully and freely. So those of you who know about blank levels, and for those of you who don't, that would be a really good other live stream, you'd be able to answer concrete questions or things where we have low language load, so rote language, counting, the alphabet, days of the week, or where you can be quite economical, so yes or no, or where really there's no risk of getting it wrong. So that tends to be the pattern. They wouldn't be able to explain or discuss or describe or perhaps use narrative. But those children are very confusing to many people. So sometimes when I've diagnosed selective mutism, teachers will say, no, they're not, because they talk. And we have to look at what it is they're actually saying. And there will usually be signs of anxiety. There'll be a wariness and a general unsureness about communicating. They don't look comfortable. High language load, they won't manage. So that's, you know, alternatives, reasoning, or where there's a chance of getting it wrong, really. So what we need to do, we need to reassure the child. So they will think that they are the only ones with that difficulty. So quite often when I meet a teenager, for instance, they've never met anybody else with selective mutism. And when I say to them, you know, well, I know quite a few children who've got it. They don't believe me. They think I'm just saying it to make them feel better. And you know, they get the message across that that's what they think. But you know, the problem won't last forever, not if it's handled right. And sometimes it's appropriate to say, you know, well, it must have been very hard not understanding language very well, or being late to talk, or etc. But we need to reassure, and we need them to know that they're not the only ones. What I find when I first see a child, or when I'm working with a child with selective mutism, I don't ask any direct questions. What's been shown is if you ask a direct question, somebody's heart rate will rise a little and their blood pressure goes up slightly. So instead of saying, instead of saying, where did you get your shoes from? You could say, wow, I love those shoes. I wonder where she got them from. I wonder if they'd fit me. And then if they're at home, even though you're a stranger, most children will actually say, Derby or Mummy bought them or whatever. And I never make eye contact with the child, because if you're making eye contact with them, that can be quite threatening. So I always look down. And I always sit lower than them. So if they're sitting on the settee, I'll sit on the floor. If they're sitting on a chair, I'll sit on the floor. So that they can look down on me, and it gives them a sense of being in charge, a sense of superiority. And that just makes everything a little bit more relaxed, and it gets me in there. The other tip that I need you to know about is that if they do talk, so on the occasion, literally it happened the other day, I praised someone's shoes and wondered where she got them from. She spoke to me, and of course what everybody wants to do then is go, yay, she spoke, that's fantastic, and instantly praise them. But we can't do that, because that is like fuss and awful for them. So just ignore it. You might want to fist pump later, but just keep it for later. We don't want to draw attention to it. Neither should we show that we're frustrated by the lack of speech. So that sounds awful, isn't it? But so many children have told me that they were very aware that their parent or their TA or their teacher was very frustrated with them that day because of their lack of talking. And of course that's less likely that they're going to talk than ever. And you know what? Sometimes children are told off for not talking. And how ridiculous is that? But it happens, and it happens quite a lot. And we need to be planning talking about selective mutism, so don't just mention it willy-nilly. It needs to be part of a structured plan. Don't draw attention to their lack of speech, particularly where others are concerned, because we don't want them to think that they are the child or the young person that doesn't talk, because otherwise, again, that pushes it further from what might happen. For younger children, avoid the dread of circle time by asking who would like a go, rather than going from one to the next, because none of us really like that. When I first had my own speech and language therapy practice, I used to go to some breakfast meetings, business breakfast meetings, and they'd typically be men, and round the table might be 20 people, and each one has a turn at saying who they are and what they do. So it's like a 5 minutes to sell yourself or sell whatever it is you're there to represent. And I find it fascinating, because most of these people, and most of them were successful businessmen, they'd be rehearsing what they were going to say in their head. So they weren't listening to the people before. And you could see the dread as it was coming nearer their turn for some people. They're adults. They're fully grown. They were businessmen. But in circle time in nursery, we expect everybody just to take a turn. And we forget that actually that can be quite hard. And it's very hard for a child with selective mutism. In nurseries, it's easy, at any early years really, it's easy to involve the whole group. So for registration, for instance, you could say, is Lucy here? And the whole group say, yes, Mrs. Smith. Is Jonathan here? Yes, Mrs. Smith, etc. So that everybody can answer together, because that will be much easier then. And while I don't want you to single the child out, I do want you to encourage them or reward them really when they try something new. So extra smiles and attention rather than anything else. Appoint a member of staff to make a special relationship with the child or young person. Building a rapport, having somebody there that they feel comfortable with is really important. And above all, don't pressurise the child or young person to speak. they will have strengths and they will have other attributes. It's not the only thing about them. You shouldn't define them. What we need to do is to make the environment right. We need to make the environment as conducive as possible for moving forwards. And one of the ways that we can do that is to actually make sure that everybody's on the same page, that everybody knows how we're going to handle it, what's useful and what we shouldn't be doing. If we're actually going to be working on a programme, I always want the child or the young person to be involved in that, because that's really important. Because if they have some control, it will reduce anxiety. When we're working with a child, so we might put a sliding in approach. So that might be where someone that they do talk to at school sees them for 3 times a week, and they're building up in a small steps approach to confident speaking. We have to make sure it's a systematic progression and we only alter one variable at a time. But gradually we're increasing the communication load at each stage. We also need to understand the child's anxiety. We can't dismiss it or say, oh, it's fine, I don't know what you're worrying about. We need to actually look at the trigger factors to that. And the other thing is we need to reinforce risk-taking rather than avoidance. So something like maybe they found swimming really, really hard, but now they can do it. So we would say, do you remember it was really difficult to jump in the pool, but you can now, you can swim. And it's a bit like that, showing them that nothing really is insurmountable. There are various things that we can use to educate home and staff. So if you go to the SMIRA website, that is SMIRA, so Selective Mutism Information and Research Association, they have lots and lots of articles and really interesting information on there. They also have 2 Facebook pages, one for parents and one for professionals, and there's a wealth of information on there. There's huge file sections, and you can just ask the question. So any question, nothing's too silly, ask the question and you will get lots of responses. I also use Can I Tell You About Selective Mutism, written by Maggie Johnson, and that's from Jessica Kingsley Publishers. It's only about £10, you can get it from Amazon. That's a really good book. And it's a quick read, so there's no excuse for not reading it and finding out about selective mutism. So let's just do a recap. Remove all pressure to speak and ensure that associations with communication are positive. So it's a balance between opportunity, but it's not expectation. And don't forget, cajoling, gentle persuasion, bribes, they're all pressure. Never remove all need to communicate. Talking about bribes, when I first moved to Dudley, there was a dad who was giving his child £1 for every time she spoke. And she was earning quite a bit actually. And that was in the 80s, so worth a lot more now, wouldn't it be? Acknowledge the difficulties, but cut them down to size. So you're playing them down, but you're not ignoring them. And we need to hide our anxiety and be positive about the future. Special relationship with at least one adult, so your rapport building for confidence and trust. And maybe you could use friends and family to mediate and facilitate communication. It's great for the children to have play dates at home. Maybe parents could come into school. So with a younger child, we can do it fairly easily. So we get the environment right and we can do maybe a sliding in approach. We have to be very careful when we do transition planning, because moving into a school can be a huge deal for a lot of children. It can be even worse if you've got selective mutism. But if it's done right, it can really work. And I've worried so much about some children when they start at school, and yet I haven't needed to, because it's a new place, new people. And one child recently said to me, but if I'd said anything at nursery, everybody would have thought that was funny because I didn't talk there, and they'd have made a fuss about it. whereas the people in his school didn't know him, so he felt that he was more able to begin to talk there. We've done lots of different ways of transition planning. So sometimes we've been to the school when there's been nobody else there at the end of the day. We've had a look round and we've looked at the cloakroom, we've looked at the toilets, we've had a really good look round. Then we've been again, and this time the teacher is in her classroom but she's working, so I say hello, but that's pretty much it. And then we've been into the classroom again where she's actually in the middle of the room, and maybe she's got a really interesting book, so we might sit and listen to her read the story, but no pressure to talk. And then we might go in and she then comes to us while we're playing a game. No pressure to talk, but just so the child is able to settle and to realise that actually it's not a massive difficult, it's not that huge brick wall that they thought it was. So where do you go when you found that a child in your nursery or your child isn't talking? Sometimes it's a shock to parents because they don't know, and sometimes people leave it until just before they're moving on to the next year group before they actually mention it to parents. If you go to the Smira website or Facebook page, there's a really good file now on where to get help. Different areas will have different policies, different ways of doing it. Some people will say, no, your GP will send you to CAMS. They're not usually that interested because it's not severe enough for them. And how can you do sort of talking therapies, they say, if you're not talking? Some will refer to speech and language therapy, and in some areas that's fine, there's a care pathway for that. In other areas they haven't, and they'll be saying, well, if they talk fully and freely somewhere else, it's not for us. So these children are falling between two stools, as it were. But don't give up, because there are lots of ways around it, and you could always take ownership of it yourself. So as I say, if you follow Smira, and especially on the Facebook pages, and there's a book called the Selective Mutism Resource Manual, it's the 2nd edition now, by Alison Wingens and Maggie Johnson, and that actually gives you everything you need to take it forwards. So I will leave it there, but thank you very much for listening, and if you have got any questions, pop them on the Facebook page. Thank you.